So I want to welcome you all to the SAGE-CASBS Award lecture. This is a great moment this is an annual lecture, and it's a great moment in the year to have this happen. And it's actually, I believe, the first time we've actually done it at CASBS, as opposed to at another venue. So CASBS, for those of you who don't know, hopefully most of you do by now, is the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. And I am Margaret Levy, and I am the director of the center and a professor of political science. CASBS has been around for over 60 years. You're sitting in its original buildings here. These were built by the Ford Foundation to house an extraordinarily distinguished group of fellows, academics on their sabbatical year, who would come for the academic year to think great thoughts, create great ideas, and have synergistic interactions with each other across disciplines and on the volleyball court and over lunch. We don't seem to use the volleyball court anymore, but we do continue to have a remarkable group of fellows every year. And increasingly, we are focused on ongoing collaborative projects on such things as the future of work and moral economies and the social life of climate change. Two of those fellows are here tonight. Inequality and equity, a whole variety of questions that are really important to us and that really need a seriously multidisciplinary approach to think them through and to start moving towards some progress, if you will, advancement of knowledge on those questions. So CASBS is the co-sponsor of this prize that was funded by Sage Publishing House, SAGE-CASBS Prize, and really by Sarah Miller McCune, who's sitting in the front row, is the real person behind this prize. Sarah is a legendary publisher who started her company at 25, and it's been a publishing house that has had a remarkable and positive impact on social science in terms of producing journals that really matter, books, training tools, really affecting the quality of social science and the emphasis on it. It's also a company that entered the digital age early and well. It's a model of how to do that. She's also a philanthropist of the social sciences, and there really, as probably many of you know, too few out there like Sarah. We could use more of her. And maybe one of the things I'll express to the engineering department is, as we develop clones, could we please clone Sarah? To give you a couple of examples of what she's done, she started out of her own foundation, Pacific Standard, another way to really take social science ideas and bring them into the public sphere. And she's been an incredible patron of CASBS, of the Center for Advanced Studies. My directorship is called the Sarah Miller McCune Director of the Center. She's endowed that. She has supported various fellows over the years, and she even endowed a study which remarkably, and by coincidence, number 4, is the one which our speaker, Bill Wilson, occupied when he was a fellow here in 1981-82. So the SAGE-CASBS Award was established in 2013, and it recognizes outstanding achievement in the behavioral and social sciences that advance our understanding of pressing social issues. It underscores the role of the social and behavioral sciences in enriching and enhancing public policy and good governance. Past winners of the award include psychologist and Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, who was a CASBS fellow in 78-79, sociologist and education rights activist Pedro Noguera, and political scientist and former U.S. Census Bureau Director Ken Pruitt, who was a fellow of CASBS in 83-84 and a member of the board. Okay, now I'm going to turn to Bill Wilson, Professor William Julius Wilson. But before I do, I just remembered that Mike asked me to remind you all that there are brochures about CASBS circulating around, and please take one and learn more about the place if you don't already have one. So So I'm really thrilled to welcome Bill back to CASBS. He's been a fellow here, a member of the CASBS board, and chair of the board. There's no way to introduce Bill succinctly, given his incredible accomplishments and undisputed status as one of the U.S. leading public intellectuals, and unfortunately a dying breed. We could use more like Bill, too, so I'm going to take you to the cloning machine as well. But I am going to try to introduce him, and I'm going to catch here from the remarkable and lengthy biography that CASBS Communications Director Mike Gattani wrote for me. It was hardly a brief. If I'd used all the info he provided me, I would be speaking longer than the minutes assigned to Bill himself, so I won't do that. I cut it down considerably. Bill has a 56-page CV, and it's not packed with anything trivial. I'll come back to his scholarly and policy contributions. Let me start with his titles, a few of his titles and honors. Sociologist William Julius Wilson is a Lewis P. and Linda L. Geiser University professor at Harvard University. And at the time of his appointment in 1995, national media covered his addition to Harvard's dream team of African-American intellectuals, including Henry Louis Gates Jr., Skip Gates, a 2007-8 CASBS Fellow. I met Bill when he was at the University of Chicago and a major force there, as he's been everywhere. And I was a slightly younger scholar then, and he was incredibly supportive, as he is. He's a mentor of renown. He started his teaching and research career in 1965 at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, shortly before completing his PhD in the sociology graduate program at Washington State University, which was a major program at that time. Yeah. He's the recipient of 46 honorary degrees. Past president of the American Sociological Association, MacArthur Prize Fellow, member of the National Academy of Sciences, American Academy of Sciences, American Philosophical Society, Institute of Medicine, National Academy of Education, British Academy, and he's also the recipient of the National Medal of Science, the highest scientific honor bestowed in the United States. Who among us, certainly I don't know anybody in this room, but admit it if it's true that you have been, but who among us has been named among Times Magazine's most influential people in the United States, other than Bill, who was in 1996? Bill has published 3 widely read to some controversial, but nevertheless seminal works of scholarship on different dimensions of race, class, and the urban poor. The Declining Significance of Race, The Truly Disadvantaged, and When Work Disappears. And I would add, even though it hasn't quite reached that pinnacle yet, More Than Just Race, I would add to that list. That's his most recent one. Bill in his work challenges liberal orthodoxy about causes of a permanent structural underclass in U.S. society, as well as conservative views that attribute the state of poverty to a dependency on welfare or cultural deficiencies. He has helped shape academic discourse and public policy debate, one of the requirements of the SAGE-CASBS Prize. He's appeared frequently on television, testified before numerous congressional committees, et cetera, et cetera. He's been advisors to mayors, to presidents, and to lots of people in the political space. Notably, it is documented that Wilson's book, The Truly Disadvantaged, influenced the philosophy and politics of the then Chicago activist Barack Obama. And Clinton told Time Magazine, Bill Clinton, told Time Magazine that Wilson's books made me see race and poverty and the problems of the inner city in a different light. Now, here's a fact that I, at least, hadn't known before. The Truly Disadvantaged inspired much of the writing that went into season 2 of the series The Wire. And his work was also a major influence on J.D. Vance in Hillbilly Elegy. So his spread is beyond politics, beyond academics, and into the public culture. The Truly Disadvantaged, the inner city, the underclass, and public policy examine the flip side of rising Black prosperity Inner city blacks with poor training and limited education, rising unemployment and welfare enrollment, and shrinking prospects for getting out of poverty. The book is awesome in its combination of astute scholarship, great writing, and impact on policy. And it was largely written here, which makes me like it even more, and one of the reasons I'm emphasizing it among his many books. I'll admit that some of his other books are just as important, and in fact, I still use all of them. But the CASBS link makes this one especially dear to me. The Truly Advantaged remains very relevant today, and as I think Bill probably agrees, regrettably so. In a second edition of the book, published in 2012, he meticulously elucidates and demonstrates how the conditions described in the first edition are not qualitatively different 25 years later. His reflections on the responses to the first edition of the book yielded a new 60-page afterword. I was going to bring the book and show it to you, but it's The Truly Disadvantaged. That is a significant scholarly contribution in itself, and cites 4 works I should mention by Paul Jarkowski, who is a fellow here this year and a professor of public policy at Rutgers. I'm almost done, and this was a cut of what Mike had given me. A significant cut. Bill is a very senior scholar, a nice way for saying he is over 80. But he is still going strong, and his contributions keep coming. In October 2016, Harvard's Hutchins Center for African American Research received a $10 million grant from its namesake foundation. The research project that it will fund, led by Wilson, is a longitudinal, empirical, ethnographic, and big data study of what he calls multi-dimensional inequality and cumulative adversity in the Boston area. People in neighborhoods subjected to multiple, reinforcing, and simultaneous racial and economic hardships. It will dig deep into the lives of poor residents to better understand the interconnecting disadvantages that perpetuate poverty. The ultimate goal is to collect enough solid data to generate insights that will influence public policy. Speaking to the Harvard Gazette in March 2016, Wilson said, "Here's my problem. How do I fight pessimism? I fight it all the time. I try to keep thinking that eventually we're going to come around to addressing our problems." So, Bill, how's the fight on pessimism going? It's been a tough day. We're about to find out. Ladies and gentlemen, our 2017 SAGE-CASBS Award winner, William Julius Wilson.
Boy, that was quite an introduction. You know, it's a real honor to return to the center, CASBS, and deliver this lecture, and I am especially pleased that Sarah Miller McCune is in the audience. You know, this is a frustrating period, in our history, and I thought that it would be good to take this opportunity to reflect on some of the issues regarding race in America that are very much on my mind. In November, shortly before the presidential election, I received an email from my Harvard colleague, Henry Louis Gates Jr., Skip Gates, we call him, as Margaret pointed out, and he was also a member of the board of Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences. He sent me an email, and he said that he had to do a coda to the HBO television series Black America After MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., to bring it up to date. And he asked me if I was optimistic or pessimistic about the future of our people. He said that he actually heard a guy on Anderson Cooper's CNN News show say, "This is the worst time in the history of our people." And Skip Gates added, "This is surely not true, but that he would love to get my thoughts about this." And I said that I completely agree that it can't be true. Anybody who says this is the worst time in the history of African Americans does not have a sense of history. In general, nothing today compares with slavery or Jim Crow segregation. However, I also pointed out that it would be accurate to say that since the death of Martin Luther King Jr., conditions for poor blacks have deteriorated, while the conditions of better off blacks have indeed improved. And this is most clearly seen in the growing income inequality in the black community, as reflected in the Gini coefficient, a measure of income inequality that ranges from 0, perfect equality, to 1, maximum inequality. Now, this figure discloses the increasing household income inequality across the American population as a whole, rising from a low of 0.39 in 1970 to 0.48 in 2013. Follow the blue line. More interesting, however, is a high level of intra-group inequality among black households. See the green line. Although the absolute level of black income is well below that of whites, blacks nonetheless display the most intra-group income inequality, reaching a household Gini index of 0.49 in 2013, followed by whites at 0.47 and Hispanics at 0.45. Indeed, one of the most significant changes since Dr. King's passing is the remarkable gains in income among more affluent blacks. When adjusted for inflation to 2014 dollars, the percentage of black Americans making at least $75,000 more than doubled from 1970 to 2014 to 21%. Those making $100,000 or more nearly quadrupled to 13%. Now, in contrast, white Americans saw a less impressive increase from 11 to 26%. On the other hand, the percentage of black Americans with incomes below $15,000 only declined by 4 percentage points to 22% between 1970 and 2014. Now, research reveals that income inequality is related to income segregation. This next figure presents data on income segregation by race in metropolitan areas with populations of more than 500,000. Now, the source for this figure is a 2014 study by the sociologists Kendra Bischoff and Sharon Reardon, published by the Russell Sage Foundation. This figure reveals that income segregation has grown rapidly in the last decade, and particularly among black and Hispanic families. And what is notable is that whereas black Americans in 1970, that's a purple line there. It is purple, right? I suffer from a little bit of color blindness. Whereas black Americans in 1970, black families in 1970 recorded the least income segregation, follow the purple line. They now register the highest income segregation. Now, please note that we are talking here about residential segregation among black families of different income levels, not segregation between black and white families. And another way of talking about these trend lines is that they describe the extent to which the exposure of families to neighbors of the same race has changed over time. And although income segregation among black families grew considerably in the 1970s and 1980s, it grew even more rapidly from 2000 to 2009 after slightly declining in the 1990s. And when considering a person's life trajectory or life chances, the differences in the quality of one's daily life between residing in a predominantly affluent neighborhood and a poor black neighborhood are huge. And it is important to note that today, poor black families have fewer black middle-class neighbors than they had in 1970. Indeed, the rising income segregation in the black community is driven both by the growth of affluent blacks and the deteriorating conditions of poor blacks, which I will soon discuss. Now, these data update the earlier arguments that I developed in my book, The Declining Significance of Race, first published in 1978. And they remind me of a recent book by the Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam entitled Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis, published in 2015 by Simon & Schuster. Now, according to Putnam, although racial barriers to success remain powerful, they represent less burdensome impediments than they did in the 1950s. By contrast, class barriers in America today loom much larger than they did back then. And this is reflected not only in growing income inequality among all racial and ethnic groups, as you see here, but also increasing disparities in many other aspects of well-being. Accumulated wealth, class segregation across neighborhoods, quality of primary and secondary education, enrollment in highly selective colleges, and even life expectancy. So, one of the major underlying themes of the declining significance of race, the changing relative significance of race and class on a black person's life trajectory, has been extended to all U.S. racial and ethnic groups in Putnam's book. Now, I wish I could share these figures with Donald Trump, these figures on changes in the black class structure with Donald Trump, who tends to talk about African Americans as if they are a monolithic socioeconomic group, that is, a severely disadvantaged group that has made little progress. Indeed, he is quoted as saying that, quote, black communities are in the worst shape ever, unquote, as if there is absolutely no good news to talk about in the black community. And since I mentioned Trump, I should say that racial tensions and the expression of racial antagonism seem to have increased after he decided to run for the presidency, which is probably one of the reasons why the guy on CNN proclaimed that this is the worst time in the history of African Americans. Now, this spike in racial tensions should not come as a big surprise. We must understand that racial antagonisms are products of situations, political situations, economic situations, social situations. You know, average citizens do not fully understand the complex forces that have increased, for example, their economic woes, the declines in real family income, the rise in wage dispersion, changes in the global economy, industry relocation, and so on. Economic insecurities create conditions that are breeding grounds for racial and ethnic tensions, especially if exclusive populist messages exploit these fears. Now, when I was writing my book, When Work Disappears, published by Knopf in 1996, right-wing messages were more concerned with controlling blacks than immigrants, whereas Donald Trump and his supporters highlighted the negative traits of immigrants and their threat to American society. I pointed out in my 1996 book that supporters of welfare reform on the political right implicitly communicated the view that blacks were undeserving of special treatment from the government and that their high rates of welfare were due to personal shortcomings, including a lack of work ethic. And just as conservative Republicans use these contentious messages in gaining control of the United States Congress in the congressional election of 1994, so too did Donald Trump employ a similar set of messages applied mainly to immigrants in his successful presidential campaign of 2016. But let me get back to what I was saying about the good news and the bad news in the black community. And in order to keep things in proper perspective when talking about the relative gains of more privileged blacks, it is important not to overlook the continuing interracial disparities. For example, a report from the Center for Economic and Policy Research reveals that before the Great Recession, there was only a 1.4 percentage point difference in the unemployment gap between recent black and white college graduates aged 22 to 27. However, in 2013, shortly after the economic downturn, the gap had surged to a 7.5 percentage point difference. Now, race is obviously a factor at play here, because historically, the periods during and immediately after downturns have adversely impacted blacks more than whites. And the issues involving race in these intergroup comparisons are complex. For example, aside from the role of racial discrimination, whites with the same amount of schooling as blacks usually attend better high schools and colleges, and therefore have an edge when employers rely on such criteria, especially during slack labor markets, that is, periods of higher unemployment. Also, researchers at the Pew Research Center released data showing that the median financial wealth of white households in 2013 exceeded that of black households by almost $131,000. So, despite sharp increases in income inequality and income segregation among blacks, the interracial disparities between blacks and whites remain huge and must always be kept in mind when discussing and highlighting growing intra-racial differences. That said, and I repeat, the conditions of poor blacks have deteriorated overall since the death of Martin Luther King Jr., while those of better off blacks have improved. A blanket statement that things are worse now for blacks than ever before is totally unwarranted. But Skip Gates also asked me if I am optimistic or pessimistic about the future of our people. So let me say that I am somewhat optimistic about the future of trained and educated blacks, and Margaret, very pessimistic about the future of poorly educated blacks. And before I elaborate on why I am pessimistic about the conditions of poor blacks, let me partly qualify my optimism about the future of trained and educated blacks. And in so doing, I want to talk very briefly about the importance and continued need for affirmative action programs. Research suggests that the white backlash against racial entitlements such as affirmative action contributed to the government's retreat from anti-discrimination policies during the 1980s. And many of the gains that trained and educated blacks experienced in the 1970s were erased during the years of the Reagan administration. Now, it should not be surprising that waning support for affirmative action programs would have an adverse effect on African Americans in particular. For example, a number of empirical studies have revealed significant differences in the family background and neighborhood environment of blacks and whites that are understated when standard measures of socioeconomic status are employed. Take, for example, the question of family background. Even when white parents and black parents report the same average income, white parents have substantially more assets than do black parents. And as I pointed out previously, whites with the same amount of schooling as blacks usually attend better high schools and colleges. Furthermore, children's test scores are associated not only with the social and economic status of their parents, but they are also affected by the social and economic status of their grandparents. This means that it could take several generations before adjustments in socioeconomic inequality produce their full benefits. Thus, if we were to rely solely on the standard criteria for college admission in highly selective colleges and universities, like SAT scores, even many children from black middle-income families would be denied admission in favor of middle-income whites who are not weighed down by the accumulation of disadvantages that stem from racial restrictions and who therefore tend to score higher on these conventional tests. So for all these reasons, the success of younger educated blacks remains dependent on affirmative action programs whereby more flexible, merit-based criteria of evaluation are used to gauge potential to succeed. Now, implicit in this argument, notice that I said flexible, merit-based criteria of evaluation. Implicit in this argument is the view that the remedy does not have to consist of numerical guidelines and quotas. The remedy can be a different set of criteria, a different set of evaluation criteria, new, more flexible, yet merit-based criteria that are more accurate than the conventional tests, engaging the actual potential of Black Americans to succeed. Criteria that capture such important attributes as perseverance, motivation, interpersonal skills, reliability, and leadership qualities. So the policy implications are obvious. Race-specific policies like affirmative action will be required for the foreseeable future to ensure the continued mobility of educated blacks. But affirmative action programs are not really designed to address the problems of the most disadvantaged and poorest people of color, including those who live in impoverished inner city ghettos. Now, because of time constraints, let me focus on just a few things that make me pessimistic about the future of poor blacks, beginning with their education in public schools. Now, research by the sociologist Sean Reardon and others reveals that schools with high proportions of black students or high proportions of Hispanic students typically tend to be schools with high proportions of poor students. And although this finding suggests a strong association between residential segregation and racial achievement gaps, the key dimension driving this association is a proportion of students' classmates who are poor. Indeed, a school's poverty rate could be a proxy for general school quality. Schools with high poverty rates may have fewer resources overall, and we definitely need more research to help explain the impact of concentrated poverty in urban public schools. And there are a number of factors to take into account. First of all, such schools may experience greater difficulty in attracting and retaining competent or skilled teachers. Also, the parents of the students in these schools generally have fewer resources, cultural capital and human capital, that would be beneficial to their children's academic achievement. This means the schools with a higher percentage of poor students tend to have a higher percentage of low-performing students, which may result in the school offering less advanced curricula. In other words, having low-performing classmates may have an adverse effect on learning by altering instructional and social processes in the classroom. Moreover, a recent study by my colleague Robert Sampson and his colleagues, and I'm quoting from the study, shows that residing in a severely disadvantaged neighborhood cumulatively impedes the development of academically relevant verbal ability in children, which affects school performance. Furthermore, the direct and indirect effects of peer influence have to be considered. Students from disadvantaged backgrounds are less likely to see a strong association between schooling and post-school employment. And finally, we have to factor in other conditions that are not usually associated with school performance. But research suggests that these factors are important. I have in mind, for example, the impact of lead contamination on poor children who live in dilapidated buildings on school performance. The effect of home evictions on children's school performance that my Harvard colleague Matt Desmond talks about. The impact of the psychological trauma of witnessing a killing in your neighborhood on school performance. And when you consider these combined factors, it's very difficult to deny the proposition that both residential segregation and school segregation contribute to the racial achievement gap. What is not clear is how they are interrelated in a relative importance. And since students tend to attend schools relatively close to home, residential segregation is a major factor shaping patterns of school segregation. But we should carefully distinguish between two types of residential segregation I have talked about: racial segregation and income segregation. The kinds of segregation in combination that are associated with poor performing schools. And this reminds me of the research of one of my former students at the University of California, Southern California, Ann Owens, the sociologist Ann Owens, I should say. In a 2016 American Sociological Review article entitled Inequality in Children's Contexts, Income Segregation of Households with and Without Children, Owens re-examined the longitudinal data here on income segregation. And her results reveal that families with children had a much higher level of income segregation than childless couples. And she hypothesizes that this is because families with children tend to seek out neighborhoods with the best schools. And I think this hypothesis really applies to higher income families in the Black community as they try to escape neighborhoods with the poorest schools, neighborhoods in which poor Blacks suffer from the combination of income segregation and racial segregation. Now let me focus for a moment on such neighborhoods to provide additional information on why I am increasingly pessimistic about the future of poor Blacks. Now, many of you are probably familiar with the story of the great migration of African Americans to northern cities in the first half of the 20th century, which seemed to offer a brighter future away from the Jim Crow segregation of the South. Well, the Great Migration did improve the quality of life for many African Americans, as reflected in the growth of working and middle-class families, as well as the significant reduction of poverty overall. But the Great Migration to northern cities abruptly ended around 1970. Because industries in the central cities, the major factor attracting Blacks from the South, relocated to the suburbs and to overseas destinations. And poor Black neighborhoods, particularly those in the Northeast and Midwest, changed from densely packed areas that had constantly seen the arrival of new migrants from the South to areas that gradually experienced depopulation. And this depopulation was caused by two developments that occurred simultaneously. The gradual outmigration of higher income Blacks, a significant change that I highlighted in my 1987 book, The Truly Disadvantaged, and the cessation of Black migration from the South, which meant that the ranks of the higher income migrants were no longer being replenished with poor migrants flowing in. And I might add that these depopulated Black neighborhoods stand in sharp contrast to the densely populated Hispanic neighborhoods, which continue to experience in-migration. And two of the marks or symbols of these depopulated areas are abandoned buildings and vacant lots, brilliantly depicted in David Simon's HBO show, The Wire, that Margaret mentioned. By the way, when Simon told me that my book, When Work Disappears, influenced the writing of season 2, man, I was walking around campus with a swagger. Now, these depopulated areas also feature high rates of joblessness, and the increasing and prolonged joblessness, the diminishing proportion of non-poor families, and overall depopulation make it more difficult to sustain basic institutions or to achieve adequate levels of neighborhood social organization. And this results in what sociologists call a weak institutional resource base. You see, it's easier for parents to control the behavior of the children in their neighborhoods when a strong institutional resource base exists. That is, when the links between community institutions such as churches, schools, political organizations, businesses, and civic clubs are strong or secure. The higher the density and stability of formal organizations, the less illicit activities, such as drug trafficking, crime, prostitution, and the formation of gangs can take root in the neighborhood. And the opposite is true in high jobless neighborhoods that feature low levels of social organization. Parents in such neighborhoods have a much more difficult time controlling the behavior of their adolescents, of preventing them from getting involved in activities detrimental to pro-social development, activities that spill over into the classroom and affect academic achievement. Now, I should also point out that some inner city neighborhoods are improving because of gentrification. There seems to be an increasing desire for many couples, especially younger childless couples, to live in the central city as opposed to the suburbs. Long commutes to and from the suburbs are increasingly inconvenient, and many higher paying and attractive jobs in creative industries and other growing sectors, research, finance, and so on, are available in a number of central cities, such as Boston, New York, San Francisco, and Seattle. However, the cost of housing and rentals are increasing sharply in many of these cities, and couples who are seeking modest cost accommodations are ready to relocate to inner city neighborhoods where redevelopment projects are underway. As these neighborhoods gentrify, their resources improve, including the creation of shopping centers and large grocery stores. And moreover, as these neighborhoods become more desirable places to live, the cost of housing, taxes, and rental properties increase, which results in a displacement of many low-income residents who can no longer afford to live there. Indeed, such developments have fueled the growth of suburban poverty. As low-income families, the entering suburbs I'm talking about, as low-income families respond to the rising costs of living in the city by relocating to peripheral areas beyond the urban cores, areas that have seen a rapid growth of concentrated poverty. Yet, while suburban poverty is increasing, 74% of high poverty neighborhoods in metro areas, by high poverty I mean neighborhoods with poverty rates of at least 40%, 74% of high poverty neighborhoods in metro areas are located in big cities. The low-income families who are able to remain in inner city neighborhoods that are gentrifying, sometimes through rent subsidies or tax abatements, definitely benefit from the improvements, but given the present political climate, I have no reason to feel hopeful that other inner city neighborhoods, particularly those that continue to experience depopulation, will improve in the near future. Thus, to repeat, whereas the future of privileged blacks, like the privileged members of other groups, looks relatively good, the overall future of poorer blacks looks very bleak indeed. And nowhere is this more apparent than when you examine the plight of low-skilled black males. The disproportionate number of low-skilled black males in this country is one of the legacies of historic segregation and discrimination. However, aside from the effects of current segregation and discrimination, including those caused by employer bias, a number of impersonal economic forces have contributed to the incredibly high jobless rates of low-skilled black males and their correspondingly low incomes. And these forces include, changes in the relative demand for low-skilled labor caused by the computer revolution, the globalization of economic activity, the declining manufacturing sector, and the growth of service industries where most of the new jobs for workers with limited skills and education are concentrated. And given time constraints, I would like to focus on this last factor associated with the relatively high jobless rates of low-skilled black men, the gradual shift from manufacturing to service industries. And this shift has created a new set of problems for low-skilled black males because those industries feature jobs that require workers to serve and relate to consumers. And in a study that we conducted in Chicago in the early 1990s, whose findings are still very relevant, many employers favored women and recent migrants of both genders who have come to populate the labor pool in the low-wage service sector over black males for entry-level service jobs. Employers in service industries felt that consumers perceive inner-city black males to be dangerous or threatening, in part because of their high incarceration rates. You see, in the past, African-American men simply had to demonstrate a strong back and muscles or to be hired for physical labor in a factory, at a construction site, or on an assembly line. They interacted with peers and foremen, not with consumers. Today, they have to search for work in the service sector, where employers are less likely to hire them because they are seen as unable to sustain positive contact with the public. Employers maintain that black males lack the soft skills that the jobs require. You know what they are: the tendency to maintain eye contact, the ability to carry on polite and friendly conversations with consumers, the inclination to smile and be responsive to consumer requests, however demanding or unreasonable they may seem. Consequently, black male job seekers face rising rates of rejection. And the prevalence of such attitudes, combined with the physical and social isolation of minorities living in inner-city areas of concentrated poverty, severely limit the access that poor black men have to informal job networks, that is, the casual networks of people or acquaintances who can pass along information about employment prospects. And this is a notable problem for black males, especially considering that many low-skilled employees first learn about their jobs through an acquaintance or were recommended by someone associated with the company. Now, research suggests that only a small percentage of low-skilled employees are hired through advertised job openings or cold calls. And the importance of knowing someone who knows the boss is illustrated by this employer's comments about a young black male to one of our interviewers. This employer stated, quote, "All of a sudden, they take a look at a guy, and unless he's got an in, the reason why I hired this black kid the last time is because my neighbor said to me, yeah, I used him for a few days. He's good. And I said, you know what? I'm going to take a chance. But it was a recommendation. But other than that, I've got to walk in. And who knows? And I think that for the most part, a guy sees a black male, he's a bit hesitant, unquote. Now, such attitudes are classic examples of statistical discrimination. In this context, I prefer the term statistical discrimination instead of racial discrimination because the black employers in our sample also expressed a reluctance to hire inner-city black males. So basically, the employers both black and white, make generalizations about inner-city black male workers and reach decisions based on those assumptions without reviewing the qualifications of an individual applicant. And the net effect is that many inner-city black male applicants are never given the opportunity to prove themselves. Now, why are such requirements a problem for black males? Simply because employers believe that women and recent immigrants of both genders are better suited than black males, especially those with prison records for such jobs. And this image has been partly created by cultural shifts in national attitudes that reflect concerns about the high rates of violence in the ghettos. In the eyes of many Americans, black males symbolize this violence. And so cries for law and order have resulted in a more punitive criminal justice system and a dramatic increase in black male incarceration. And the high incarceration rates of low-skilled black males are very much connected to their high jobless rates. It's a vicious cycle. Being without a job can encourage illegal money-making activities in order to make ends meet, which increases the risk of incarceration. And upon release from incarceration, a prison record carries a stigma in the eyes of employers and decreases the probability that an ex-offender will be hired, resulting in a greater likelihood of even more intractable joblessness. And forced to turn to the low-wage sector for employment, inner-city black males, including a significant number of ex-offenders, have to compete, often unsuccessfully, with a growing number of female and immigrant workers. And if these men complain or otherwise manifest their dissatisfaction, they seem even more unattractive to employers and therefore encounter even greater discrimination when they search for employment. And because of feelings many inner-city black males express about their jobs and job prospects reflect their plummeting position in a changing economy, it is important to link these attitudes with the opportunity structure that is the spectrum of life chances available to them in society at large. And this brings me to the subject of Black Lives Matter. The Black Lives Matter movement has dramatically called attention to violent police encounters with blacks, especially young black males, who, given their very circumstances, are more likely to have confrontations with the police, which reinforces the negative perceptions they have garnered. Aided by smartphones and social media, Americans have now become more aware of these incidents, which very likely have occurred at similar levels in previous decades, but were under the radar, so to speak. However, I think it would be good to expand the focus of the movement to include groups that are not usually referenced when we discuss Black Lives Matter. And I'm referring to ordinary residents who are often innocent victims of criminal offenses in poor inner-city neighborhoods and have called for more police protection, not less. And to repeat, these people are usually not referenced when we talk about Black Lives Matter. And in this connection, I recall a conversation that I had several decades ago with a mother who resided in one of the poor inner-city neighborhoods on Chicago's South Side. A stray bullet from a gang fight had killed her son, who was not a gang member. And she sadly lamented that his death was not reported in any of the Chicago newspapers, not on TV, not on radio, not in electronic media. And I distinctly remember her saying that no one cared, Mr. Wilson, that my son was killed. No one cared. And as I pointed out previously, when income segregation is coupled with racial segregation, low-income blacks cluster in neighborhoods that feature disadvantages along several dimensions, including exposure to violent crime. Take a look at this figure, which captures this graphically. In 1978, poor blacks aged 12 and over were only marginally more likely than affluent blacks to be violent crime victims, roughly 45 and 38 per 1,000 individuals, respectively. However, by 2008, poor blacks were far more likely to be violent crime victims, about 75 per 1,000, while affluent blacks were far less likely to be victims of violent crime, about 23 per 1,000. And violent crime can reach extraordinary levels in the poorest inner city black neighborhoods. That's why, David Simon's The Wire, it was such an important show, because he captured this violence. For example, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where 46% of African Americans live in high poverty neighborhoods, those with poverty rates of at least 40%, blacks are nearly 20 times more likely to get shot than a white person, and 9 times more likely to be murdered. Now, some people are reluctant to talk about the high murder rates in cities like Milwaukee because, one, it might distract our attention from the vital discussions about police violence against blacks, and secondly, it runs the risk of providing ammunition to those who resist criminal justice reform efforts regarding policing and sentencing policy. But Jill Leovy of the Los Angeles Times, an author of the book Ghetto Side, published in 2014, raises another issue. She asserts that the relatively low priority placed on solving the high murder rates in poor inner city neighborhoods, as reflected in the woefully inadequate resources provided to homicide detectives struggling to solve killings in those areas, represents one of the great moral failings of our criminal justice system and of our society. Indeed, the thousands of poor, grieving African American families whose loved ones have been killed tend to be disregarded or ignored even by the media. And although the nation's consciousness has been aroused by the repeated acts of police brutality against blacks, the problems of public space violence, seen in the extraordinary distress, trauma, and pain many poor inner city families experience following the killing of a family member or close relative, also deserves our special attention. And the use of the phrase, the other side of Black Lives Matter, coined by my former student Louis Quaquant of the University of California, Berkeley, could help to create such an awareness. The other side of Black Lives Matter. Now, let me just end by saying that, in closing remarks, by saying that when I wrote The Bridge Over the Racial Divide, which was published by the University of California Press in 1990, I was hopeful that we could create a climate in the United States that could lead to a constructive dialogue on how problems associated with the disappearance of work among certain segments of our population can be addressed, including problems that result in neighborhood violence that traumatizes the residents. Despite the fact that such problems tend to be more severe in poor inner city neighborhoods, I nonetheless felt that they should be discussed not in isolation, but as a part of a more general dialogue, which focuses on the concerns of ordinary Americans, concerns that the poor, working, and middle classes of all groups share, including concerns about crime in the neighborhoods, declining real wages, job security and unemployment, escalating medical and housing costs, and the availability of child care programs. And I also argued in my 1999 book that programs created in response to these concerns, despite being race neutral, would disproportionately benefit the inner city jobless poor, but they would also benefit large segments of the remaining population, including the white population. And I stated that the framers of this message should be cognizant of the fact that these groups, although often seen as adversaries, are potential allies in a reform coalition because they suffer from a common problem, economic distress caused by forces outside of their control. And this argument is as true today as it was when I wrote The Bridge Over the Racial Divide in 1999. And it is being repeated by some observers in the U.S. post-election analysis and debates, including those who maintain that the Democrats' emphasis on identity politics, an attempt to mobilize people of color, women, immigrants, and the LGBT community, tended to ignore the problems of poorer white Americans. And one notable exception they point out was Bernie Sanders' progressive and unifying populist economic message in the Democratic primaries, a message that resonated with a significant segment of the white, lower, and working class populations. However, Sanders was not the Democratic nominee, and Donald Trump was able to capture notable support from these populations with a divisive, not unifying, populist message. So I end this lecture by once again returning to some of the basic arguments I presented in my 1999 book, The Bridge Over the Racial Divide. And I hope that you don't mind if my closing comments sound more like those of a public intellectual than a scholar. But in the age of Trump, these comments are even more relevant and important. Because the problems of social inequality, the gap between the expanding have-nots and haves are growing more severe. A vision that acknowledges racially distinct problems and the need for appropriate race-specific remedies, but at the same time emphasizes the importance of multi-racial solutions to shared problems, is more important now than ever. A new democratic vision must reject the commonly held view that race is so divisive that whites, blacks, Latinos, Asians, and Native Americans cannot work together in a common cause. Those articulating the new vision must realize that if a political message is tailored to a white audience, people of color draw back, just as whites draw back when a message is tailored to racial minority audiences. The challenge is to find issues and programs that concern the families of all racial and ethnic groups so that individuals in these groups can honestly perceive mutual interests and join in a multiracial coalition to move America forward. I cling to this vision. I cling to this vision in my efforts to overcome a feeling of deep pessimism about the plight of the inner city poor. Thank you for being so attentive.
I'm Sarah Miller McCune, And I am practically speechless, which hardly ever happens to me. But it is my honor, as well as my pleasure, to give you the SAGE-CASBS Award, which is on the table in front of us. And I guess I should be giving it to you. So let's try it this way. And it does come with a check, which is in this envelope. And I am just really, really thrilled to have heard this speech, and I will remember it always. Thank you.